1944. In a dust-choked Texas kitchen, the war felt both a million miles away and staring right back at you. A group of German prisoners of war, their faces grim under the sun, sat before a meal laid out by a quiet American widow. They'd been told Americans were soft, their food childish. And when they saw the jars of peanut butter, they erupted in laughter, mocking the strange, brown paste in their own language. But then one of them, a former baker, dared to take a taste. The laughter died. His expression wasn't disgust. It was pure shock. They were just prisoners eating a meal. But they were about to learn that this childish food was a lesson in mercy that would change everything. For more incredible stories that prove humanity is more complicated than we think, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. The year was 1944, and the heat in Miller Creek, Texas, had a weight to it, pressing down on the cracked earth and the souls of the people who worked it. War was a distant headline, a crackle on the radio, but its ghosts were everywhere. In the gold star hanging in the post office window, in the tired eyes of the women running farms, alone, and now, in the stiff, gray-green uniforms of the enemy soldiers who had been sent to work the very fields American boys had left behind. Inside the Collins farmhouse, Mary moved with a practiced economy that left no room for wasted motion or thought. Her husband, Tom, had been gone for over a year. His memory, a quiet ache, she folded away each morning with the bedsheets. Grief had hollowed her out, and duty had filled the space. The German prisoners of war filed into her kitchen for their midday meal, their boots shuffling on the worn linoleum. They were boys, mostly, with faces too young for the hard set of their jaws. They carried themselves with a rigid pride that seemed foolish under the vast Texas sky, a fragile shield against the humiliation of their captivity. They sat at the long pine table without a word, eyes cast down, an island of silent, resentful men in the heart of her home. Mary placed plates of thick ham sandwiches before them, alongside a bowl of potato salad. It was plain, sturdy food. And beside the plates, she set 2 glass jars with cheerful red lids. She unscrewed one, the metallic pop loud in the tense quiet, and placed a butter knife beside it. Inside was a substance none of them had ever seen. A thick, swirling, tan-colored paste. Peanut butter. A low murmur rippled through the men. One of them, a broad-shouldered boy named Richter, nudged the man beside him and whispered in German, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "What is this? Grease for the tractor?" A few of them chuckled, the sound dry and sharp. They looked at the jar as if it were an insult, a symbol of the soft, unserious country that had captured them. Americans, they had been told, were decadent children, their culture as bland and strange as this ridiculous paste. They ate their ham sandwiches with sullen purpose, pointedly ignoring the jars. Mary watched them from the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water. She didn't understand their words, but she understood their laughter. It was the same mocking sound she'd heard from boys in the schoolyard, the kind meant to build a wall by tearing something else down. A familiar anger, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her composure. Her Tom had eaten peanut butter sandwiches his whole life. He had loved them. And these men, who wore the same uniform as the men who had taken him from her, were laughing at his memory. She scrubbed a plate harder, her knuckles white. But one of the prisoners wasn't laughing. Carl Fisher sat at the end of the table, his gaze fixed on the jar. He was slighter than the others, with the careful, observant eyes of someone used to watching and waiting. Back in Bremen, his father's bakery had been his entire world, a universe of textures and smells, of precise measurements and the magic of yeast. This American paste was bizarre, but it was still food, an invention born of a different kitchen in a different world, and his baker's curiosity was stronger than his pride. Richter noticed his stare. "What's the matter, Fisher? You want to try the baby food?" he sneered. The others grinned. Carl felt his face flush, but he didn't look away from the jar. He looked at the American woman by the sink. Her back was to them, but it was a straight, unyielding line of resilience. She had made this food for them. It was a duty, nothing more, yet she had done it. Slowly, deliberately, Carl reached for the knife. He dipped it into the jar and pulled out a sticky, tan glob. The men at the table fell silent, watching him as he spread it on the last corner of his bread. He lifted it to his mouth, the scent unfamiliar, nutty, salty, and faintly sweet. He took a bite. The texture was the first shock, a thick, clinging glue that coated the roof of his mouth. It wasn't grease. It was something else entirely. Then the flavor hit him, a deep, roasted saltiness that melted into a surprising, subtle sweetness. It was rich. It was good. His expression, which had been braced for disgust, slackened into pure, unfeigned surprise. Richter was watching him, a smirk on his face, waiting for the joke. But Carl only took another, larger bite, chewing thoughtfully. The smirk on Richter's face wavered. Another man, intrigued by Carl's silence, tentatively reached for the jar. Then another. Soon, the only sound in the kitchen was the quiet scraping of knives and the soft sounds of men chewing. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a shared, silent discovery. Richter, his curiosity finally winning out, tried some himself. His eyes widened. He looked at Carl, who was now scraping the last bits of peanut butter from his plate, and a low chuckle escaped him. But this time, the sound was different. It wasn't derisive. It was bewildered, a sound of admission. Another man laughed, then another, until the whole table was filled with a soft, rolling wave of genuine, incredulous laughter. It was the sound of boys discovering something new and absurd and wonderful, all at once. Mary turned from the sink, drying her hands on her apron, and saw them. They were no longer soldiers of a hostile army. They were just young men, laughing together in her kitchen, their faces softened and human. Carl caught her eye from across the room, a faint, sticky smudge at the corner of his mouth. A smile touched his lips, hesitant, but real. And to her own profound surprise, Mary felt the tight knot in her chest loosen, and she smiled back. It was a fleeting, fragile truce in the middle of a world at war, a bridge built from bread and peanuts. That night, in the dim, cramped barracks, long after the other men were asleep, Carl sat on the edge of his cot. He pulled a small, worn notebook and a pencil stub from beneath his mattress. By the pale moonlight slanting through the dusty window, he began to write. He wrote to his mother, though he knew the letter would never be sent. He described the endless fields, the blistering sun, the food. He paused, thinking of the strange paste, of the unexpected laughter, of the woman's brief smile. "Today they gave us food for children," he wrote in his neat, controlled script. "They call it peanut butter. We laughed at first, but it was more kindness than I have had in years. It was more kindness than I deserved." He put the pencil down and stared out the window at the dark, alien landscape of Texas, the war suddenly feeling more complicated, and his own heart more vulnerable than it had in a very long time. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun. The German prisoners worked the cotton fields, their gray-green uniforms quickly coated in a fine layer of Texas dust. Under the watch of a single, tired guard and the farmers whose land they tilled, they bent and straightened, their movements becoming more fluid as they learned the particular ache of harvesting a crop they'd never known. The local men who supervised them were not cruel. They were farmers first, their language the practical dialect of soil and weather. They offered water from a shared ladle and demonstrated the right way to pluck a cotton boll without getting pricked, their interactions brief and businesslike. It was a cautious, wary fairness, a truce born of necessity. The Germans, for their part, worked with a sullen efficiency. They were soldiers, and even in defeat, they understood discipline. Mary often watched them from the porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl. The rhythmic thump of pod against tin, a counterpoint to the distant sounds from the fields. Her eyes would invariably find Carl. He worked differently than the others. Where Richter attacked his row with a brute, resentful, force, and others slouched with weary indifference, Carl's movements were precise and economical. He wasted no energy, his hands moving with a practiced grace that seemed out of place in the sprawling, messy work of the fields. There was a restraint in him, a quiet self-containment that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. One afternoon, while sorting through a chest of Tom's belongings, she found a stack of his letters from basic training. She ran her thumb over his handwriting, the letters neat, perfectly formed, each line a model of control even when he wrote of his exhaustion. That was it. Carl had the same kind of stillness, the same air of a disciplined inner world that Tom had possessed. The recognition was a small, sharp pang in her chest. He was the enemy. Yet, in that small, specific way, he reminded her of her husband. A few days later, she baked an apple pie, the scent of cinnamon and warm sugar filling the small house. It was her daughter's favorite. As she cut the slices, she paused. On impulse, she slid an extra piece onto a small plate. When the men came in for their water break, their faces flushed and streaked with sweat. She waited until Carl was the last one at the pump. The other men were already walking back toward the fields, their voices a low murmur. She walked over, holding out the plate. She said nothing. He looked from the pie to her face, his expression one of confusion, then dawning surprise. He hesitated, then took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the offering, a perfect triangle of golden crust and warm apples. A piece of home offered in the middle of nowhere. "Danke," he murmured, then corrected himself, his voice raspy from dust and disuse. "Thank you." His English was thick, the words awkward and halting, but the gratitude in his eyes was clear. Mary simply nodded and walked back to the house, her heart beating a little faster. It was a foolish, dangerous thing to do. She knew that. The whispers started at the general store. Mrs. Gable, whose nephew was fighting in France, saw Mary buying an extra bag of sugar and gave her a look as sharp as a bayonet. "Heard you're feeding those krauts mighty well," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the aisle to hear. "Hope our boys are getting the same treatment over there." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Others chimed in. "They're the enemy, Mary. Don't you go getting soft on them. It ain't right, not after what they did to your Tom." Mary paid for her sugar, her face a stoic mask, and walked out into the unforgiving sunlight. The town's grief had curdled into a hard, righteous anger, and she was now on the wrong side of it. That evening, sitting on the porch swing, she held one of Tom's letters in her lap, the paper worn soft at the creases. The town thought her kindness was a betrayal of his memory. They believed that to hate his enemies was to honor him. But as she looked out over the darkening fields where he had once worked, she knew they were wrong. Tom had been a man of quiet decency. He fixed fences for his neighbors and shared his tools without being asked. He would not have wanted his memory to be a cage of bitterness. Mercy, she decided, did not erase grief. It was the only thing that could make room for life to grow alongside it. The following Sunday, a day of rest for the prisoners, Mary set the long kitchen table for their lunch. She laid out cold chicken and bread, pickles and cheese. And in the center of the table, she placed 2 full jars of peanut butter. When the men filed in, they saw the jars immediately. A hush fell over them. Then Richter, the perpetual cynic, broke into a wide grin. He picked up a knife, but instead of plunging it into the jar, he held it aloft like a wine steward. He gestured to Carl. "Fisher," he declared in German, his tone one of grand ceremony. "Our expert, you will do the honors." Carl, a faint blush on his cheeks, took the knife. With mock seriousness, he unscrewed the lid, sniffed the contents with the air of a connoisseur, and then dipped the knife in, examining the sticky paste as it clung to the blade. He spread a perfect layer on a slice of bread and held it up to the light. The other men played along, nodding with feigned solemnity. One of them raised his water glass in a toast. Another bowed deeply from his chair. Soon, they were all spreading the peanut butter with comical formality, passing the jars with exaggerated politeness, and taking bites as if they were sampling the finest caviar. The tension of the week, the heat, the suspicion, it all melted away in a wave of shared, absurd humor. And as Mary watched them from the doorway, a sound she hadn't heard herself make in over a year bubbled up from her chest. It was a laugh, full and unburdened. The men stopped their performance, surprised, and looked at her. And then they smiled, their faces lit with a genuine warmth that needed no translation. That fragile bubble of laughter, born in the warmth of the farmhouse kitchen, could not survive the harsh realities blowing in from overseas. The goodwill that had begun to sprout between the prisoners and their reluctant hosts was a tender shoot in barren ground, easily crushed. The news arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by the telegraph boy on his rickety bicycle. It was a single, devastating slip of paper for the Henderson family, who farmed the plot of land bordering the Collins place. Their only son, Billy, a boy of 19 with a shock of red hair and a grin that could charm the bees from their hives, had been killed in action somewhere in the forests of Belgium. The telegram didn't say how. It never did. It only offered the cold, stark fact of his absence. A silence fell over Miller Creek, heavy and suffocating as a wool blanket in August. The laughter from Mary's kitchen seemed like a distant, shameful memory. The shared joke over peanut butter felt like a sacrilege. The town draped itself in a collective mourning that was thick with a renewed and venomous anger. The Germans, once a source of reluctant curiosity, were now a living, breathing reminder of the town's loss. They were the enemy who had stolen Billy Henderson, and every bite of food they ate, every drop of water they drank, was an offense to his memory. The whispers that had once been confined to the general store now echoed from the church steps and across backyard fences. "Our boys are dying and we're feeding theirs pie." The sentiment was a poison, seeping into the soil, turning the cautious fairness of the farmers into a clipped, cold indifference. The water ladle was no longer shared. Instructions were barked, not given. The fragile bridge of humanity that had been built was collapsing under the weight of a fresh grave. The prisoners felt the shift immediately. The air grew thick with unspoken animosity. The farmers' eyes were hard, their mouths set in grim, unforgiving lines. The easy rhythm of the work was gone, replaced by a tense, resentful drudgery. Carl saw the pain etched on the faces of the townspeople, saw the black wreath hanging on the Hendersons' door as they were marched past the farm each morning. He understood. He had seen the same grief on the faces of women in Bremen, had heard the same silence fall over a street when a telegram arrived. The uniform he wore made him a symbol of that pain, and there was nothing he could do to separate the man from the soldier in their eyes. But his baker's hands, the hands that knew how to create and mend, felt uselessly empty. He wanted to do something, not to atone. He knew that was impossible, but simply to acknowledge the shared human fact of their loss. In the barn, where tools were stored, he found a small discarded block of seasoned oak. That night, after the others were asleep, he took his small pocket knife and began to carve. He worked slowly, the blade whispering against the wood, shaving off thin curls that smelled of earth and time. He was not a master carver, But he was patient. He carved a simple cross, its lines clean and unadorned. It was a small, humble thing, an object of solace, the only gesture of respect he could offer from his side of the war. The next morning, he approached the guard, holding the wooden cross in his palm. In his halting English, he tried to explain. "For the family," he said, pointing toward the Henderson farm. "For the son." The guard, a weary man named Thompson, looked at the cross, then at Carl's earnest face, and for a moment, his expression softened. He took the cross and promised to give it to the Reverend to pass along. But when Reverend Harlan presented the small token to Mr. Henderson, the grieving father recoiled, as if he'd been struck. His face, already a mask of sorrow, twisted into a snarl of outrage. "A cross? From one of them?" He spat, his voice thick with rage. "Is this some kind of sick joke? They kill my boy and now they mock me with their religion?" He threw the small wooden cross to the ground, where it landed in the dust. The gesture was refused, the thread of connection severed before it could ever be tied. The news of the rejected cross spread through the barracks, and a new kind of despair settled over the men. They were condemned, hated not just for the war they had fought, but for a humanity they were not allowed to show. That evening, Mary was clearing the dinner plates when she heard a sound from the barn, a crash, followed by the sharp tinkle of shattering glass. Her heart pounded. Escape, riot, all the fears the town had been whispering about rushed through her mind. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and crept toward the barn, her footsteps silent in the soft dirt. Peeking through a crack in the wooden slats, she saw him. Carl was standing alone in the dusty shafts of moonlight, his shoulders slumped in defeat. On the floor at his feet lay the shattered remains of a glass peanut butter jar. He must have saved it. A strange, secret souvenir. Now it was broken. He stared at the empty, broken thing, and she heard him mutter something in German, his voice choked with a raw anguish she didn't need to understand to feel. "Ich werde nie wieder nach Hause kommen," he whispered. "I will never see home again." He was trapped, a pariah to his captors, and a failure to his own code of conduct. He was utterly, completely alone. And in that moment, watching the enemy soldier break in the quiet darkness of her barn, Mary felt her own carefully constructed walls of grief and duty crumble. His despair mirrored her own. She too felt trapped between honoring the dead and acknowledging the living, caught in a war that demanded a hatred her heart was no longer sure it could sustain. The broken jar on the floor was more than just glass. It was their shared, shattered hope. The weeks that followed were heavy with a suffocating, unspoken tension. The brief warmth of shared laughter was a distant memory, replaced by the grim, silent work of the harvest. The prisoners kept their heads down, their movements mechanical, their faces shuddered against the cold stares of the townspeople. Mary continued her duties, serving the midday meals with a stoic neutrality that betrayed none of the turmoil in her heart. She avoided looking at Carl, afraid of what she might see in his eyes, afraid of what he might see in hers. The distance between the farmhouse and the barracks had become a vast, uncrossable chasm of grief and suspicion. But the image of him in the barn, surrounded by the shards of that broken jar, stayed with her. It was a splinter in her mind, a constant, nagging reminder of a sorrow that looked so much like her own. One afternoon, while the men were in the farthest fields, the guard, Thompson, approached her on the porch. He was an older man, weary of the war, and the role it had forced him to play. "Ma'am," he began, twisting his cap in his hands, "we got orders to do a search of the barracks. Just routine. But that German, the quiet one Fisher, he's got a little book he keeps. Worries me it might be, plans or something." Mary's heart gave a little jolt. An escape plan? It didn't seem possible. It didn't fit the man she had observed. "He keeps it under his mattress," Thompson continued. "I ain't much for reading, and it's all in German anyway. But you seem to have a good head on your shoulders. Maybe you could, just take a look, before I have to report it." It was a breach of every rule, a dangerous request born of a soldier's intuition that something wasn't right. Mary hesitated for only a moment. She nodded. She found the notebook exactly where Thompson said it would be. It was small, its cover softened with use, held together with a piece of twine. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. It was not filled with maps or coded messages. The pages were covered in Carl's neat, controlled script, but among the lines of German text were drawings and lists. She saw a detailed sketch of her kitchen stove, with notes on how the flue worked. She saw a recipe for apple pie, the ingredients listed first in German, then in halting, phonetically spelled English. And then she saw the letters, page after page of them, all addressed to a Mutti in Bremen. They were letters from a son to his mother, filled with careful reassurances that he was safe, that he was being fed. He described the vastness of the sky, the strange birds, the taste of sweet corn. He never mentioned the hard stairs or the long hours. He was protecting her, even from across an ocean and through the walls of a prison camp. Then Mary found a page that made her stop breathing. At the top, in careful lettering, he had written, "Das Brot des Friedens," the bread of peace. Beneath it was a small, charmingly clumsy sketch of 2 slices of bread, with a thick layer of brown paste spilling out the sides. He had written about that first day, about the men's mockery turning to surprised laughter. He hadn't written it as a story of humiliation, but as one of unexpected discovery. He described the taste, salty and sweet, strange and comforting. He wrote that for a single, ridiculous moment, eating that childish food, he had forgotten he was a prisoner. He had just been a boy in a kitchen, tasting something new. Her eyes scanned the page, and one sentence stood out, a sentence she knew would change everything. "They gave us this simple food," he had written, "and for a moment, I did not think of the war or the fighting. I thought of my mother's kitchen. We are enemies. But in that taste, I remembered that we are all sons." Mary closed the book, her hands no longer trembling. This was not the journal of an enemy soldier plotting escape. It was the diary of a homesick baker's apprentice, a boy trying to hold on to his own humanity with the only tools he had, memory and observation. The next Sunday was the town's monthly potluck gathering after church, held in the sparse community hall. It was meant to be an occasion for comfort and fellowship, but since Billy Henderson's death, the gatherings had been somber affairs, laced with grief and quiet anger. Mary walked in carrying a casserole dish and Carl's notebook, tucked safely in her large purse. When the meal was over, and Reverend Harlan was offering a final prayer for the boys overseas, Mary stood up. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, the woman who had been the subject of so much gossip. "I have something I need to share," she said, her voice clear and steady. She pulled out the notebook. "This belongs to one of the prisoners." A low murmur rippled through the room. Mr. Henderson's face hardened. Mary held up a hand. "I know what you're thinking, but I want to read you something." Her gaze swept the room, meeting the suspicious, grieving eyes of her neighbors. She looked at the Hendersons, at Mrs. Gable, at Reverend Harlan, whose own son would never come home. She took a deep breath and began to read, her voice translating Carl's simple, honest words. She read about the taste of peanut butter, about the memory of a mother's kitchen, about the sudden, shocking realization that they were all just sons. When she finished, a profound silence filled the hall. It was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't empty or angry. It was full, contemplative, heavy with the weight of a new and difficult truth. A woman in the back row quietly began to cry. Mrs. Gable looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. Mr. Henderson did not speak, his face still a mask of pain, but the rigid fury in his jaw had softened. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. He had heard, he had understood. The war had not been erased. The loss had not been diminished. But for the first time, the enemy had a human voice. The wall of righteous anger had not vanished, but a crack had appeared in it, letting in a small, fragile ray of light. Dignity, for a moment, had been restored on both sides. A week later, the prisoners were transferred to another camp. As they lined up to board the truck, Mary walked out to the edge of the farm. She was holding one last, unopened jar of peanut butter. She walked directly to Carl and held it out to him. He looked at the jar, then at her, his eyes filled with a deep, questioning gratitude. He said nothing, knowing that words were inadequate. He simply took the jar and gave a slight, formal bow, a gesture of profound respect. And then, for the first time since that day in the barn, he broke into a small, genuine smile. It was a smile of farewell, of understanding, and of a shared memory that would outlast the war. Decades later, in a small, rebuilt bakery in post-war Bremen, a young boy would ask his grandfather about the strange, American sandwich he sometimes made. The old man, Carl Fischer, would just smile and open a faded notebook to a page titled Das Brot des Friedens, and the story of unexpected mercy, born from a simple jar of peanut butter, would be passed on.